There is a specific, glorious type of confusion that only blossoms when an American tourist tries to teach a Brit about their own history. I've become a collector of these moments, a curator of a museum that exists only in the space between what is and what someone from Ohio is absolutely certain must be. Last autumn, I was at Stonehenge, listening to the wind whistle through those ancient stones. When an American dad held court nearby, he was telling his kids, with the absolute certainty of a news anchor, that it was a primitive power grid for transmitting messages between tribal leaders. A prehistoric internet, he called it, pointing at the lintels as if they were giant Ethernet ports. A German tourist next to me leaned in and whispered, in perfect English, "Is this part of the official audio guide?" I felt a duty to step in, gently mentioning the prevailing archaeological theories about astronomical alignment and Neolithic ritual. The man gave me a pitying smile, the kind you reserve for a puppy trying to do algebra. "We covered this at my son's school in Texas," he said, as if settling the matter. "The curriculum's very thorough." He spoke as if my ancestors had left the final chapter of their own story blank. A cliffhanger waiting for the State Board of Education in Austin to fill it in. It wasn't arrogance, not exactly. It was the serene confidence of someone whose worldview has no appendix for ambiguity. In London, outside the Tower of London, I heard a teenager declare to his friend that the crown jewels were obviously replicas. "The real ones are in a vault in like Delaware or something," he explained, nodding sagely. "For security. It just makes sense." When I interjected, pointing at the ancient walls and mentioning they'd been here, guarded, for centuries, he shrugged with the effortless logic of youth. "Yeah, but America has better insurance. And more advanced lasers." His reasoning was a perfect, impermeable bubble. To pop, it would have felt cruel, like telling a child the truth about the tooth fairy while they're still clutching the coin. But the peak, the absolute summit of this particular brand of cognitive dissonance, arrived on Westminster Bridge. A woman, phone in hand, was furious that Big Ben was, in her words, running slow, not her watch. The actual clock tower, the giant iconic symbol of a time zone, she marched up to a patient-looking policeman. "Your famous clock is an hour behind New York," she stated, a fact she found both obvious and offensive. The PC just stared, his training not covering this particular scenario. I tried to help, playing the friendly local. "It's on Greenwich Mean Time," I offered, gesturing vaguely eastward. "You know, the meridian? 0 degrees. She shook her head, not in negation but in pity for my simplistic understanding. "That's the problem," she clarified. "You should sync it with the financial markets. It's basically a stock market clock, right? So it should match Wall Street Open." I looked from the Elizabeth Tower, steadfast and Victorian, to her, utterly convinced of her financial pragmatism, and felt a part of my brain, the part that handles chronological perspective, gently switch off. It was the only sane response. Here's the psychological, not at the heart of all this. When your national identity is fundamentally built on the idea of being new, of a revolutionary fresh start, the concept of old isn't just foreign, it's an existential puzzle. The entire timeline of the United States, from Plymouth Rock to the present day, could fit comfortably between the construction of Westminster Abbey and the invention of the sandwich with room to spare. So when confronted with something genuinely, dustily, Moscovidly ancient, the American mind doesn't always see layered history. It sees a prototype, a fascinating, sometimes charming, but ultimately unfinished first draft. To the American tourist, Britain isn't always a country with a continuous past. It can feel like America's charmingly outdated beta version, full of quirky bugs they later fixed. This prototype theory extends to every facet of life. I was in a 15th century pub in Canterbury, all low, crooked beams you had to duck under, and flagstone floors worn smooth by centuries of spilled ale. When an American businessman lamented the lack of electrical outlets, you'd think, for a historic replica, they'd add some modern conveniences. He sighed to his wife, tapping his dead phone on the oak table. I told him, unable to resist, that the building's foundation was laid before Columbus even had a bad map. He was older than his country. He patted the massive wooden beam beside him. A tree felled during the Wars of the Roses. Solid craftsmanship, he conceded. You can tell they used good aged materials to get that authentic look. The breathtaking conclusion was that he thought it was a themed restaurant. The beam, which was literally holding up the roof he was sitting under, was, in his view, a prop. A very convincing prop, but a prop nonetheless. The past was not a lived reality, but an aesthetic choice, a decor theme like Tuscan villa or industrial chic. The logic, once applied, expands like a cultural Big Bang. If the buildings are merely early models, then the language must be too. In a bookshop in Bath, eavesdropping shamelessly, I heard a university student explain to her friend that British English was the original open-source code. A foundational but clunky system. American English, she declared, was the sleek, user-friendly 2.0, update more intuitive, less redundant. She then applied this software metaphor to literature. Shakespeare, she reasoned, was a brilliant but early developer. His work was foundational code. But it needed American studios and publishers to patch the plot holes, optimize the dialogue, and add the special effects that made it globally popular. I stood there, holding a hefty collected works, and nearly offered it to her as a fan to cool her down. The idea that the language itself was a beta test, waiting for transatlantic refinement, was a conceptual leap that left me dizzy. It's crucial to understand this reframing isn't born of malice or even ignorance in the classic sense. It's a cognitive coping mechanism for a nation with a startlingly short, self-contained historical memory. America is the undisputed protagonist of its own sweeping cinematic story, a tale of revolution, frontiers, and becoming a global power. In that compelling narrative, everything important either originates on its soil or is validated, amplified, and given meaning by arriving there. The rest of the world, therefore, isn't a collection of parallel stories. It's the fascinating, sometimes picturesque, and often slightly confusing supporting cast. Our histories are prologues to their main event, or quaint subplots. This worldview gets truly creative when applied to governance and geography. At Windsor Castle, I once heard a woman ask a beleaguered guide if the king needed a passport to travel between his palaces. It must be such a paperwork headache, she sympathized, imagining forms in triplicate for a trip to Balmoral. The guide, with impeccable politeness, explained that he was moving within his own country. The woman frowned, the gears turning. But they're different castles, she insisted. In America, crossing state lines in an official capacity requires notifications, motorcade coordination. It's a whole thing. She had effortlessly, and with genuine curiosity, mentally divided the United Kingdom into a series of autonomous castle-themed city-states, each with its own border control. The concept of a unified kingdom older than her homeland simply didn't compute. Her brain defaulted to the closest analogy it had: the sovereign states of the USA, the natural world. You might think would be immune to this. It is not. Hiking in Snowdonia, I passed a group of Americans debating the scale of the mountains. They're pretty, don't get me wrong, one said, gesturing at the stark, glacial crags. But they're more like large, ambitious hills. The Rockies would eat these for breakfast. His friend nodded in agreement. It's like the landscape is still in standard definition. Beautiful, but you can see the pixels. They were reviewing 400-million-year-old geology, sculpted by ice ages, as if it were a Netflix documentary with a mediocre rendering budget. A Welsh hiker passing in the other direction caught my eye and muttered, "Their country's so young, they think erosion is a design flaw." He wasn't being unkind. It was an observation of pure philosophical difference. To them, antiquity was a potential selling point for a building, but for a landscape, it seemed to imply a lack of recent upgrades. If the landscape is in standard definition, then the museum is the director's commentary track, and this is where the phenomenon reaches its sublime, baffling zenith. In the hushed halls of the British Museum, I observed a man stare at the Rosetta Stone. He didn't marvel at the key to hieroglyphs. Instead, he mused to his companion, "It's incredible, isn't it? How much American academia helped decipher this?" His companion, not missing a beat, agreed. "Absolutely. Without the grants and research from our universities, this would just be a fancy rock with good branding. They were standing before one of the most significant archaeological finds in human history, an object that unlocked a dead civilization, and their primary takeaway was a quiet shout-out to New England endowments. The stone, weathered and silent, thankfully, did not reply. The confidence required to annex the narrative of the Rosetta Stone, to make it a supporting player in the story of American academic excellence, is a particular kind of superpower. This confidence is the engine of it all. It's a formidable, often enviable, force. It fills every gap in knowledge, not with hesitant doubt or a question mark, but with a seamless, internally consistent, and often highly pragmatic narrative. Facts are optional, secondary. The story must flow, must make sense on its own terms. American confidence doesn't question history. It politely, and with a friendly smile, rewrites it into a version that fits the user's manual. You see it in the small moments. On the London Eye, a tourist told her captivated family it was clearly inspired by the Seattle Great Wheel, but they made it taller for the London skyline. I didn't have the heart to explain that George Ferris debuted his wheel in 1893 Chicago, and the concept of a rotating observation platform is hardly proprietary. She was happy. The story worked. London saw a cool American thing and built a bigger one. It was a tidy, satisfying origin myth. The Thames, ignorant of this revised history, kept flowing silently below. This recasting extends to popular culture in ways that boggle the mind. In Stratford-upon-Avon, I once overheard a conversation where a visitor suggested that the reason Shakespeare's themes felt universal was because they'd been stress-tested by the American film industry. The plays are like a good framework, the person said, but it took Hollywood to find the emotional through-lines that really connect with a modern, global audience. The playwright, in this formulation, was a supplier of raw narrative material. The real alchemy, the meaning-making, happened in California. It's a breathtaking inversion of chronological and cultural influence. Even social customs are not spared. In a quiet village pub, an American visitor was perplexed by the lack of a tipping prompt on the card machine. He explained to the bartender, who was also the owner, that a gratuity workflow was essential for service staff motivation. The bartender, pulling a perfect pint, simply said, "I pay my staff a proper wage, love. We're all good." The visitor left, I suspect, believing he'd witnessed a quaint but inefficient labor practice, rather than a different social contract. And let's talk about food. The humble pub roast dinner has been described to me as a deconstructed Thanksgiving plate. But with less commitment, the full English breakfast was once deemed a bold attempt at a fry-up before the concept of brunch was optimized. Afternoon tea. A nice snack service, but where's the free refill? Each observation isn't a critique of taste, but a recalibration towards an American norm. The original is not the standard. It is an earlier iteration of what they have perfected. So, what have I learned from my years as a silent anthropologist in my own land? I've learned that the most entertaining, thought-provoking, and strangely enlightening tour of Britain you will ever take isn't in a guidebook. It's happening in the mind of a well-meaning, curious, and supremely confident American visitor. They will gift you versions of your homeland you could never have imagined. They will explain that the Romans built their famously straight roads, not for military efficiency, but as practice runs for the American interstate system. They will refer to a rainy day as some pre-American precipitation. They will look at the National Trust, that guardian of historic houses and coastline, and see not a preservation society, but a really committed historical reenactment group with amazing real estate. And honestly, I've come to cherish it. This isn't sarcasm. Each of these bewildering, hilarious claims is a tiny, painless cultural collision. They create light, not heat. They don't erase our history. They accidentally highlight its sheer, immovable weight by showing how another, equally valid culture stumbles over it. It's a reminder, delivered with comic timing, that how we see the world, its history, its scale, its very purpose is profoundly shaped by the story we tell ourselves about where we fit in it. My story is one of gradual accumulation, of layers upon layers. Theirs is one of revolutionary genesis and perpetual improvement. When they visit, those stories bump into each other, and the friction generates these sparks of glorious misunderstanding. If you want to understand the dynamics of the 21st century, don't just look at diplomacy or trade deals. Watch what happens at a grassroots level when a nation that sees itself, for better or worse, as the finished product, the definitive edition, visits a continent that is, quite literally, the living archive of the draft. It's there, in the confusion over castle borders and the ratings given to ancient mountains, that you see the soft power of narrative in action. It is endlessly fascinating. This is Old World X. If these glimpses into the glorious humane chaos of cross-cultural misunderstanding made you smile or think, then do us a solid. Like this video. It tells us you want more of this blend of gentle psychology, social observation, and painfully funny real-world anecdotes. And, of course, subscribe. The world is absolutely full of these stories. These delightful, confounding moments where perception and reality have a polite but firm disagreement. We're here to trace their contours, to listen in, and to share the laugh. Now, it's your turn. Drop your own best American tourist story, or your story of being a tourist utterly bewildered abroad, in the comments below. We all need the collective chuckle. Cheers.